Good evening, everyone. I am so pleased to be here with you and with ASALH this evening. My name is Wanda Lloyd, and I am the author of Coming Full Circle from Jim Crow to Journalism. This is my memoir, which spans my life growing up in the Jim Crow South in Georgia in the 1950s and 1960s, which of course was a time when laws restricted our social, economic, community, and educational life. Through my long, and also it took me through, the memoir goes through my long career as a daily newspaper journalist. We lived in communities where all of our neighbors were African American, some who were well educated, and some who didn't complete high school, but we lived harmoniously in the same community. And of course, the socioeconomic levels were different, but that did not matter because we were a community of folks who had so much in common. Families who wanted to see a better life for their children, hardworking people, working class community, as well as a middle class community. This memoir, which was published in February 2020, just before the pandemic, as other authors have mentioned, this memoir has 4 themes. The first theme I call history or Jim Crow, and I read about growing up in a family of largely educated women. I write that mine is not a rags to riches story. My family was well educated. We owned our own business. My father owned his own business. And yet I was a girl who dared to become a daily newspaper journalist, even though we had no role models in Savannah, Georgia, where I grew up. There were no role models who were daily newspaper journalists, not on television. I just dared that's what I wanted to do. I started, we in our school, we had, of course, secondhand books. We had furniture that was handed down. We had, of course, it was a segregated school. We had great teachers who were educated mostly at HBCUs, but who had to leave the state of Georgia to get their graduate school education because they could not go to the state schools in the state of Georgia. We never went to restaurants. Our commerce was on West Broad Street, the seat of Black commerce in Savannah. We boycotted in the early 60s. We boycotted the downtown stores to force those employers to allow Black employees to do something other than sweeping the floor or working in the dining room. So we went through all of that in my childhood and my young years. The second theme is journalism, of course, because that was my life's work. That was my career. I was editor of my high school newspaper. I was editor of my college newspaper at Spelman College. And then after I graduated, I worked at 7 daily newspapers, always as an editor, never as a reporter. I really started out knowing that I wanted to be a top editor someday. My papers included the Washington Post and USA Today, the Miami Herald. And then I retired as the executive editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. My goal was to run a small paper, a small town paper in the South, and I met my goal. I retired in 2013. In this book, I tell so many stories about the many challenges of my newsroom career through the lens of colleagues and readers, many of whom did not want to see me do this kind of work. But it was so fulfilling for me, and I really journalism was my whole life. The third theme is diversity. I had a role in addressing the role of the lack of diversity in the nation's newsrooms. We had very few people of color. When I started in the business, we started measuring people in 1978. I went into my first newsroom in 1970. So in 78, when we did the first census of daily newspapers, we had 4.5% of the population in daily newspaper newsrooms were people of color. Almost all of those at that time were African Americans. And so the challenge was, how do we increase the number of people? How do we hold newsrooms accountable for reflecting the population? And I spent a lot of time, a lot of my years as diversity committee chair for the American Society of Newspaper Editors, And I was the founding executive director of the Freedom Forum Diversity Institute at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. And the fourth theme is leadership, because I became a leader, but more importantly, I became a mentor. As I said, there were no mentors for me. So it was just really important for me to mentor young women, young African-American women, and a few young men as well. It was—
Okay, it's updated. Okay, let me look.
Okay. So leadership was the fourth theme. I watched Charlene Hunter enroll at the University of Georgia because she too wanted to be a journalist. And we watched the turmoil on TV when she and Hamilton Holmes were the first African-Americans who were escorted onto the campus by the state patrol. I really wanted to go to the University of Georgia because I grew up in Georgia, and my family said no, they didn't want me to go to school to be a martyr at that time. They wanted me to go to school and get a good education in a comfortable place. There were several women in my family who had attended Spelman and graduated from Spelman. And so I just applied to Spelman. That was my only choice. And I applied to that one school. I don't think I could get in these days. It's so competitive. I doubt it. After my newsroom career of more than 4 decades, I retired to become associate professor and a chair of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications at Savannah State University. And as I was meeting with the seniors primarily through their practicum course, they would ask me questions because they knew I had not been in the academy all of my career. And they asked me questions about how I got, how did I come to be a professor, because they knew I had been in journalism. And I would tell them stories about my career in newsrooms. And they enjoyed so many of my stories that my students started encouraging me to write some of those stories. And that's really the genesis of coming full circle from Jim Crow to journalism. The coming full circle part of the title is I started in Savannah. Even though I went to Spelman College when I was a student in high school, I took a summer journalism course on the campus of Savannah State. And so for me, that was really coming full circle. And of course, the Jim Crow to journalism part was my career spanned from Jim Crow to through the rest of my life. The book, as I said, was published in 2020. I had to quickly pivot to do a virtual tour. And so I really have enjoyed presenting this book at universities and bookstores and with faith groups, history groups, museums. And I really enjoyed, telling some of my stories. I would be happy to take your questions because we only have another 10 minutes, I believe. So I'm going to end it there. Are there any questions? I will say, while folks are thinking of questions, you can also get more information about me on my website, which is quite simply wandalloyd.com. The book is published by New South Books in Montgomery, where I lived for the last 9 years of my daily newspaper career. And it was a publisher that I knew about while I was living in Montgomery. So I had a really good relationship publishing this book with them in Montgomery, even though I'm living in Savannah now. It is a memoir. There's a question from Juanita Powell Williams. It is a memoir of my career and my life. Yes. Hi, Barbara. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm trying to read. And can you, and more need to do just that. I had the pleasure of listening to Barbara Dunn just a few days ago for Founders Day when she spoke to the Savannah Yamacraw branch. And I admire her so much for telling her story. And I really encourage other people to tell your own stories. I have a very good friend who did a biography of someone. She was on for her PhD She was doing a biography of a journalist. And when I called her and asked her to write a blurb for my book, she raved about how excited she was that I was telling my story. This is before she read the book, because she said it was so difficult to find information about an African-American who had been a pioneer journalist in the Black press many years ago. And so I do encourage everybody, if you can, to tell your own stories. It's really important. Are there other questions?
There is a question by Ms. Pinson. She asked, what is the biggest challenge you think Black journalists face today?
Oh my goodness, there are so many. First of all, there are not nearly enough of us in leadership. And that's really where we have to focus our efforts in getting Black journalists at the top of news organizations. I am so happy to see that there are a few more now, especially Black women in the last couple of years. When I left the newsroom, well, when I was in the newsroom, there were 4 women who were leading daily newspaper newsrooms. That does not count television, of course. There may have been fewer leading television newsrooms. When I left, there were 3. And so now I haven't counted lately, but I think that's the biggest challenge, because as we, in order to make our news organizations accurate, because diversity really is accuracy, we really have to diversify the ranks of leadership. It's not going to happen if we don't have leaders who understand the importance of that. That's not to say that white journalists are not understanding of our stories, but in order to make that difference in newsrooms and in communities, we really need to see more people in leadership roles. The other challenge, I guess, would be that there are some people who don't want to see us in these roles. And so sometimes it can be a little difficult getting information. But I am so happy to be a longtime member of the National Association of Black Journalists. And we have thousands of members now. I was inducted into the National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame in 2019. And there are thousands of us now, probably around 3,000 to 4,000, I really don't know the exact number, as members of the National Association of Black Journalists, even more who are not members. And so getting more people in newsrooms is very important.
Ms. Lloyd, as a young journalist, I started with NABJ. I started on my college campus, and then I continued throughout my career. It is such a support. We do have another question by Lemuel Patterson. What was a challenge as you moved from Northern newspaper to the Southern press? Was there a difference?
Well, there is a difference. I worked for the Gannett Company, which I went to work for Gannett at USA Today, and I worked at 3 daily newspapers in the Gannett Company. And I went to that company because they cared about diversity, because the CEO and other top officials in the company articulated the importance of having diversity at all levels. Some of the Southern newspapers did not like that. And so when I went to Greenville, South Carolina, and then of course in Montgomery, many people told me, this is no longer our newspaper. They would actually tell me that to my face. And they told my publishers, who were all white except for one. The last one was African-American, but they would tell them the same thing. We want our paper back. And so that was one of the challenges, making sure that we were covering the whole community. There are some people who don't want to, they don't see the Black community as part of the whole community. And our job is not just to cover the Black community, but we need to be inclusive of all communities, all races, gender, ages, abilities, political, all of that. And so that was probably one of the biggest challenges I had as an African-American woman. Thank you. I see Bernice Bennett. Would you like to ask your question? You want me to ask it? As a Black female, was it difficult for you to make a point without being called out as an angry Black woman? I was never really called as an angry Black woman. I think our Black men were had a bigger problem with that. They were called arrogant a lot of the time. I have a calm nature, and so I've never heard anybody call me that. In fact, I felt a little guilty when I retired and they had a big party, going away party for me, because everybody said, oh, she's so nice. She's so nice. And my first thought was, oh, I shouldn't have been so nice. Maybe I should have been a little tougher. But not me personally. There are some who do. And I think that when we walk away with that stigma, that behavior, some of us don't rise to the top ranks. So we have to be very careful about that. And of course, we had lots of training in that regard as a young journalist. And Daniel, as you know, at many, many workshops at NABJ that teach us how not to be angry all the time.
Yes.
How do I feel about the news? How do I find you mean the news organizations? I think our local news organizations, in a lot of places, do a fair job of covering the community. I think they're getting better all the time. I see a little bit more diversity among the staff. I was not a fan of the local media when I was here because it was very racist when I was growing up. And it was like that throughout the South. Very difficult. You know, we would only see ourselves on page one when usually young men who were in trouble with the law. And the good news stories, as we call them in the business, hardly ever made the front page or any of the section fronts. And so that's one of the challenges. And I'm starting to see our local media do a little bit better about that. And of course, because we have in Savannah specifically, we have Black leadership in terms of our mayor and our city council members. They got to cover us because we are in charge. We are running the city. So it has to reflect what's going on in the community. Okay, are there any more questions? Well, I would be very happy to talk to any of you who have an interest in me speaking to your classes or any other groups that you're a member of. I love telling some of my stories. I tell the story of my family. Was a very kind of a non-traditional family. My mother, Gloria, I thought was my sister until I was a teenager because she left me with my grandmother, as people tend to do in the South a lot. I was raised after age 8 by my aunt and uncle who owned a funeral home. And so I tell stories about growing up in a funeral home, but I also tell stories about how my mother returned from New York and New Jersey where she lived. And it was very difficult for her to come back and visit me. She was kind of angry every time she came south because she wasn't living in the Jim Crow South anymore. She grew up in Savannah. And I think, from what my grandmother said, she sort of had to leave town when she became an adult because she probably would have been in trouble with the law. But I tell individual stories about some of the hardships of growing up in the South in terms of, just being safe in our community, but also the closeness that we had. But mostly I tell stories about my love of writing and editing and how at the end of my 11th grade year, my journalism teacher, a Black woman who never set foot in a newsroom in her life, who was teaching us out of a book, she pulled me aside and said, I think you have a future in journalism, and I'd like to make you appoint you to be the editor of our high school newspaper in your senior year. And that's how I got my start. That was my first editing role. I was elected editor of the paper at Spelman College, and I got an internship at the Providence Evening Bulletin between my junior and senior year, and I went back to Providence. So here's this girl from the South who grew up in the Jim Crow era and living in Rhode Island, sitting across the copy desk from all white men who were just great mentors to me. But I was scared to death because I had not interacted with white people very much. I had never interacted with white people except maybe to go downtown and go shopping when I was in high school. And in college, we had a few white professors, but for the most part, going to Providence for this girl from the South was so challenging for me personally. And so people who knew me then say, oh my goodness, where did your personality come from? Because you were so quiet in the early years. So my 7 papers were the Providence Evening Bulletin, the Miami Herald, the Atlanta Journal, the Washington Post, which was my longest newsroom. At USA Today, I became senior editor. I was the number 3 person in the newsroom. I worked there for 10 years. Then I came south again as managing editor in Greenville, South Carolina, at the Greenville News. I took a break for 4 years and went to Vanderbilt to start a program to teach journalism at Vanderbilt. The Diversity Institute was a program to teach non-traditional, students, all people of color who were looking for a second career change. The Freedom Forum generously built and gave to Vanderbilt a $7 million building and put me in charge of that program. And then I was ready to take that top job in Montgomery, Alabama. And that was kind of a scary thing too, because there were so many obstacles in Montgomery, but we did great work in Montgomery. And it is a career that I love, mentoring young people, because I think that's very important. And I would just love to share my story with anyone that might want to hear it.
Do you have an email address that you can share with everyone in the chat?
I sure do. Oh, it didn't go. It's W. Lloyd. Did it go through? WLloyd0712@gmail.com. I'm putting it in again. And if you go to my website and go to the comments, it just comes straight to that Gmail account as well. There it is. I'm really pleased to present my story to members of ASALH. Would love to talk to some of your ASALH branches. Also, I joined ASALH in the early 70s because W.W. Law, who started the branch here, and he was our president of the NAACP and led the city through civil rights movement. And I was living in Washington, D.C., and he called and told me about this organization called ASALH, invited me to join, and I did. I wasn't in Savannah, so I wasn't an active member, but I was a member. And so when I returned to Savannah in 2013 and we got that charter, Mr. Law passed away and the charter went dormant. And when we got the charter back, somebody helped me, maybe it was 2019, I believe. I was delighted. Yes, I was delighted to return to ASALH because I think it's important work that we're doing, making sure that young people understand our history. And that's my story is my history. And so it's a good fit for ASALH. But 2020, thank you, Barbara, 2020. Yeah, that's right. Right before or during the pandemic. Yes. Thank you, Juanita. You said we are the children of the same period, so I identify with much of what you stated. Yeah, that's why I didn't spend a lot of time on Jim Crow, because people in this group know what Jim Crow is. But when I speak to other groups, I like to talk a little bit more about Jim Crow because young people really don't know. You know, when I was talking to the students at Savannah State, it was almost as if they were taught in school, they were taught about the Civil War, a little bit of Reconstruction, and then there was the Civil Rights Movement. And so a lot of them did not know about the Jim Crow era. Some of them would ask me because they knew I grew up in Savannah. They would say, well, what were your favorite restaurants to go? And I was like, well, we didn't go to restaurants because we couldn't, well, where did you shop? Well, we had trouble shopping at some places. And so really sharing those stories about Jim Crow was part of my mission to inform young people about that era. Because I think as we all know, in order to know where we're going, we have to know where we've been.